Before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe. The Middle Ages were ruled by kings, queens, dukes, and barons. But who gave them the right to rule? Why did millions of people obey a single family? The answer lies in one of the most powerful and clever ideas in history, the divine right of kings. This wasn't just a tradition. It was a cosmic religious guarantee that gave the monarch ultimate, unbeatable authority. Imagine having a job where your boss isn't just a CEO, but God himself. That's how a king saw his role. And that's how he demanded his subjects see it too. The core concept is deceptively simple. God himself selects and appoints the king to rule on earth. Therefore, the king is not responsible to his people, his nobles, or even a parliament if one existed. He is responsible only to God. This idea was incredibly useful because it gave the king three enormous superpowers. First, there was irresistible authority. If you questioned the king's decision, you weren't just committing treason. You were committing sacrilege, a crime against God. This theological threat shut down arguments and rebellions before they could properly form. Second, there was legitimacy. It didn't matter if the king was the strongest warrior or the cleverest administrator. The fact that he was the king proved he was chosen. This made him the only legitimate ruler, often passed down through a very long, sacred family line, which was crucial for stability. The royal bloodline itself was considered holy. Making the crown hereditary power flowed through the veins, not from the ballot box. Any attempt to seize the throne was not just a political coup, but a spiritual contamination of the divine line. Third, and perhaps most practically, came absolute power, because his power came directly from God. No earthly power, no noble, no judge, no law could truly limit what he did. His word was law, and he was seen as the living embodiment of justice, the fountain of justice itself. This meant the royal courts and every judge in the land ultimately derived their authority from the king's divine appointment, making him the only recognized source of order and peace within the realm, the protector of the king's peace. This concept wasn't always a formal, written doctrine, but it was woven into every ceremony, every church sermon, and every piece of royal propaganda across Europe. To ensure everyone truly believed this, the church played a crucial role. The most powerful proof of the divine right was the coronation ceremony. This was far more than putting a shiny hat on a sovereign's head. It was a sacred religious ritual meant to transform the man into a holy monarch. During the coronation, the monarch was anointed with holy oil by a high-ranking cleric, like an archbishop. This ritual mimicked the ancient anointing of Old Testament kings, showing the populace that the new sovereign was literally sanctified by God. After the anointing, the monarch was presented with the crown, the scepter symbolizing justice and power, and the orb symbolizing the world he was now commanded to rule. These symbols weren't just decorations. They were props in the greatest political show on earth, confirming the contract between God and king in front of thousands of witnesses. The divine right was constantly reinforced by the church, which instructed the vast, uneducated population through weekly sermons that the king's authority was absolute and unquestionable. In some kingdoms, this divine connection was believed to grant the king supernatural abilities. Most famously, the king's touch, where the monarch was believed to be able to heal certain diseases, such as scrofula, known as the king's evil, simply by touching the sick person. This ritual made the king not just a ruler, but a quasi-religious figure capable of performing miracles, further cementing his divine status. While the divine right sounds like a theological concept, its real value was intensely practical. The biggest threat to a king wasn't usually a foreign army. It was the powerful local lords, barons, and dukes who had their own private armies and castles. If a king tried to raise taxes, build a new castle, or send a lord's son to war, that lord might simply say no. But with the divine right, the king could silence dissent. I am acting in God's name. To defy me is to risk eternal damnation. This belief system was incredibly effective at stopping civil wars and keeping the decentralized chaotic feudal system functional under a single person. Every single promise of military aid or tax collection within the feudal pyramid from one. The peasant to the baron was ultimately justified by the king's sacred position at the very top. When the king held court, his decisions were not just political, but considered divinely inspired verdicts. This provided a powerful, supernatural tool for centralizing power, pulling authority away from the squabbling local nobles and placing it firmly in the royal palace, thereby legitimizing the creation of strong, standing royal armies and uniform legal systems across the realm. The king claimed his power came directly from God, who was the second most powerful person in the realm, the Pope. And this led to the greatest political rivalry of the Middle Ages. It's often called the conflict between regnum king and sacerdotium priesthood. The king's view: I am God's chosen ruler on earth. My power is absolute in my kingdom. The Pope's view: I am God's vicar on earth. I crowned you, I blessed you, and I can potentially unbless you. As the spiritual health of your soul is above your temporal power, the Church, headed by the Pope, held massive moral and spiritual power. When a king acted badly, like seizing church land, appointing his own bishops, or ignoring religious law, the Pope's ultimate weapon was the excommunication. Being excommunicated meant being thrown out of the church, unable to receive the sacraments, and potentially condemned to hell. In a world defined by faith, this was terrifying. Even worse, the Pope could declare an entire country under interdict, meaning no one could receive sacraments, no marriages, no last rites. This massive spiritual pressure often forced even the most stubborn king to kneel before the pontiff, showing that while the king had divine right to rule the land, the Pope was often the one holding the keys to the heavenly back door, creating a tense balance of power that defined medieval European politics. The divine right of kings worked for centuries because society was primarily agrarian, deeply religious, and generally uneducated. But as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and early modern period, a few things began to chip away at this idea. The rise of cities and literacy: with increased trade and growing cities came merchants, lawyers, and educated people who weren't necessarily nobles or priests. They started asking questions based on reason, classical philosophy, and newly accessible legal codes, rather than just blind obedience to divine faith. The Magna Carta and early parliaments, even though the divine right was strong, powerful nobles sometimes forced the king's hand. Documents like the Magna Carta, signed in 1215 in England, established that even the king was bound by certain laws, a tiny, important crack in the idea of absolute power. The rise of early representative bodies like parliaments created a counter-voice that spoke on behalf of the realm, challenging the king's singular authority, arguing that the king should rule not above law, but by law. New philosophies, later thinkers, particularly during the Enlightenment, proposed radical new ideas. What if political power came from a social contract and the consent of the governed, the people, rather than from God? These revolutionary ideas eventually led to conflicts and revolutions that completely changed how countries were run. But for the majority of the Middle Ages, the divine right of kings was the invisible, powerful shield that legitimized every monarch and kept the crowns firmly atop the heads of Europe's royal families. It was the ultimate divinely sanctioned monopoly on power.